Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to get into elite shape, or perhaps just make improvements to your current level of fitness, check out the Mountain Tough digital training program. You can try it for free for 14 days, and you can see the results for yourself. The app allows users to train wherever they are with minimal equipment requirements, whether you're in the gym or you're outdoors or you're at home. Users can access top-tier programming that fits into their lifestyle. The Mountain Tough app offers expertly designed progressive training plans that guide users from start to finish. These plans are tailored to build resilience, strength, and endurance over time, preventing burnout and injury. The app features self-guided and follow-along coaching videos, allowing users to be coached through every workout step by step. This helps to ensure proper form, motivation, and intensity, regardless of the user's fitness level. The Mountain Tough app delivers training programs built for the unique physical demands of mountain athletes, including hunters, tactical professionals, and outdoor adventurers. The programs themselves are designed by seasoned strength and conditioning experts, elite athletes, and military veterans. Start your 14-day free trial today and check out the results for yourself. And be sure to use the offer code CHANGEAGENTS, and I'm looking at it as one word, at sign-up, and you can get 40% off your annual subscription. Remember, use the offer code CHANGEAGENTS at checkout.
Is this gang more likely a kind of franchise that bonds various criminals that have come out of Venezuela? Probably. Similar to MS-13 and Barrio 18, these other street gangs from Latin America. So it's more like a franchise operation, I would imagine, where they're operating siloed. I mean, I can't see how Araguan gangsters in Colorado are in any way linked to someone in New York City, other than by the name of the gang that will carry some weight in their community.
How can I help? How can I be useful in ending needless suffering? Do not be afraid of work that has no end.
We have to organize a social movement.
We have an opportunity to lead by example versus just talking, hot air. I think the more people in this fight, the more we grow. Eventually it could change. The people are the ones that can make the change.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Change Agents, an Ironclad original presented by Firecracker Farm. All right, dude, you ready to talk violent crime and gangs?
Always.
Okay. How do you say this correctly? Tren de Aragua? How do they say
Aragua.
it?
Yeah.
Aragua.
I got to be
Okay.
ready. I got to be really careful because I think my Spanish pronunciation is terrible these days.
They're going to
And
hate
and
us either way, so it doesn't even
Yeah.
matter.
Yeah. I'm used to it.
Yeah. I mean, maybe let's start right there. Give us a brief background on that particular gang, where they come from, what's their jam. Fill us in. Paint.
Yeah.
I'll hand the brush and canvas over to you. Paint as you will.
I shall go to town.
Okay.
The Tren de Aragua. I hope I'm getting that right, but it kind of begins in 2005, and that is when a young guy by the name of Hector Rutherford, very strange name, Guerrero Flores, and people call him Nino, which I'm going to call him now because that's way easier.
See, I'm going to call
Um,
this TDA from here on out just to make sure that my horrible Spanish pronunciation, at least people understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I should probably do the same. Um, so in 2005, this guy, he's 22 years old. He murders a policeman in this state, Aragua, which is kind of like 60 miles west of Caracas, the capital of Venezuela.
Okay.
So he goes down for this. He gets in prison, and then a bunch of things happen on a country level that lead to his rise, and he becomes the leader of this gang. So he gets moved to this huge prison called Tocoron, which is in Aragua, his home state, after being bumped around a few facilities. And then two very strange things happen. The first is that then leader Hugo Chavez, crime is out of control, especially in Caracas at this time. This is the famous era of the Torre David, the Tower of David, you might have seen on Homeland. It's kind of like out of control, half-built building, kind of lived in by thousands and thousands of squatters. Drugs are going through the roof there. And he decides to set up something called peace zones, which is an ironic name. And he
Hmm.
basically, if you've watched The Wire, this is Amsterdam from The Wire. He says, you guys in the gangs, you can live as you want, you can do your own thing. We won't go into your neighborhoods. Just don't do too much crime. Just be nice, guys. Don't do too many murders. Don't deal drugs." And they're like, "Yeah, cool. All right, that sounds great." And as you might expect, these street gangs, they get wildly powerful off the back of this. And they kind of carve out areas of the entire country just to, deal drugs and commit murders and all the things they're not supposed to do because they're naughty boys. So this is in 2013, right? So this is after our main guy moves to Tokoron prison. And then shortly after that, they have this system called the Prane system. I hope I'm saying that right. Prane. And they do a similar thing with the peace zones, but inside prisons. So because they have no money, they've run out of money and they can't control prisons, they decide, well, the safest thing to do is to actually put them in control of bosses of the underworld.
What?
So, yeah, I think there's some insane stat like of 30 prisons in Venezuela at the time. I think like 8 or 9 of them are fully controlled officially by gangs. So the wardens are under the thumb of the gangs. And that's when our guy, Nino Guerrero, that's when he gets really big. So he's able to control peace zones outside of prison from behind bars, where incidentally he runs the entire facility. And I think he has like a nightclub and a bar, and I think there's like a prison zoo and like actual zookeepers under his command. This is so out of control. It's kind of clownish. Um, and
And so
then,
he went in. So he went in when he was 22 years old.
yeah, he's been
A-
behind this entire time. Yeah.
Any backstory on who this guy was prior to the murder? About where he, the upbringing, what led him to that murder? Did he kind of just come from violence? Did he fall into it, or?
There's not much about him before he actually goes to prison, but it sounds like he's a pretty common or garden street criminal. There's nothing particularly impressive or outlandish about the way that he grows up. It's just a really violent time and a really difficult time across the country. Because I guess by that point in the early to mid 2000s, the kind of Bolivarian revolution, the socialist stuff is kind of falling on its backside. Um, so everyone's growing up poor. It's kind of like the Hunger Games, and
Mhm.
that's the world that he comes out of. Um, but then
How
the
did he
state
rise?
makes him.
Well, and how did he rise in prison? I mean, imagine you go to that prison. It's probably not people who are the most peaceful. How did he separate himself and rise? I mean, really poor way to describe this, but rise to the cream of the crop of what was going on in
Yeah.
prison and actually be the person who comes out with substantial amounts of power in comparison to his peers.
Yeah, I don't think he won the Debate Society awards. Like I
But I
think,
would assume not.
yeah, he's incredibly violent, very, very violent guy. Um, Deaths in prison are skyrocketing at this point. It's really, really awful conditions, as you might expect from a gang-run prison. So he kills his way to the top. He eliminates his rivals. Um, but then for a long time, there's a kind of like uneasy peace between the gangs because they've effectively siloed the gangs in prisons and in these peace zones, right? So
Mhm.
in a way, the more concerning part is the time when it goes quiet and these gangs are able to just carve out, a living and sort of fortresses and bastions in these cities across Venezuela. Um, and there are two guys that are big at this time. Nino Guerrero, the boy from Aragua, he's coming up, but he's not the biggest. The biggest is a guy called El Coqui. Um, and he manages to make it to the ripe old age of, I think it is 40 or 42, which is, in these terms, is basically a pensioner.
Yeah, in a
Um,
game of violence, he's an old school player.
yeah, he is. He's the OG. Um, but in 2018, I think there's like a shootout. He goes on the run. He gets killed by the cops. So cocky. So it just paves the way for the Aragua gang to come through, and that's when they really consolidate their power as the biggest gang in Venezuela, and they get help, it's said, from up above in the political sphere. And then they venture out of the country, and that's when we start to hear of them kind of venturing across Latin America and eventually making their way to the States.
I think most people in the States, they may not understand yet that we're one of the headlines, and this might be driven largely from the political cycle that hopefully we are going to be peacefully working our way through in the next few
Hmm.
weeks. I am hoping at such a deep level that I can log on to social media platforms and hear about something other than elections or thoughts on politicians. Or I'm
Yeah.
hopeful,
Yeah.
but I'm also not optimistic. I'll just put it that way. Um, one of the things that people or articles and candidates have talked about is Colorado. And again, because
Mhm.
of my poor ability to pronounce the TDA in Colorado, specifically a housing complex. And I definitely want to get to that, but I wanted to tie to or link to people so that they know we're not just talking about something here in Venezuela. This is actually likely an offshoot, and I'll rely on you to kind of describe how that happened, of a gang that did start in Venezuela. So this has trickled its way all the way across, like you said, Latin America and into the United States, it would seem.
Yeah, it's got echoes of MS-13 and then the kind of Salvadoran street gangs in the way that it kind of makes its name in those from sort of 6, 7 years ago until now. So these guys, they kind of spread. Venezuela, as we know, is like a crumbling economy. It's kind of incredibly sad story, really. They have like some of the largest proven oil reserves on earth, but they just don't make any money, and horrible sort of autocracy going on there. So this gang sort of spreads into neighboring Colombia and tries to take over some of the narco routes along that way. But it doesn't manage to do it because these are routes controlled by gangs who are far more powerful, far more violent. You've got the former FARC rebels in Colombia who are controlling large swathes of that anyway. So they don't manage to do that, but what they do make money from is migration. So huge smuggling industry on these porous borders in the edge of the Amazon. And so the Araguans, they make a huge amount of money from this, and obviously some of them also filter north from there as well. So this is when you hear of them. They get big in. So strangely, they get big in Chile as well. They've got quite a presence there, and then kind of more affluent Latin American nations. But they are in the States for sure.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, how embedded are they? It's very hard to parse the media story right now because, I mean, some of it's pretty shoddy reporting, in my opinion. I mean, I've
Yeah.
seen stuff in the New York Post, for example, that kind of from one day to the next says they're nothing or they're everything or they have tattoos, signifiers, they don't have tattoo signifiers. Either one of these is supposed to be scary because we either don't know who they are or we do know who they are. They're in migration centers, they're not. Um, so when I was researching the group, I found quite a lot of discrepancies in the media reportage about them. Um, I think the kind of TLDR is they are present, but they're not as present as the media and some sides of the political divide are making out. It's kind of it's a very easy boogeyman because
Yeah.
they're a violent street gang, but they are not in any way as powerful as pretty much any other gang operating in the US at the moment. What they are doing is pretty horrible crimes, right? So because they're because they made their name in migration, they tend to do a lot of sort of sexual violence, crimes against migrants, um, really kind of low level street thuggery. I mean, there's guys, they have this almost pathological hatred of the cops, despite the cops not having sort of prosecuted them for years. So ex-Venezuelan cops who are now living in, I think a lot are living in Florida. I think that's also happening in Colorado. They've been targeted and murdered by members of this gang. There was a guy in Miami who was dragged from his house and beaten to death in his truck. That was quite recently. All of this is quite new. I mean,
Mhm.
these are very new stories. It's very fresh, and they're running kind of pimping rings in various cities around the US. That's probably that's probably where the most worrying, the most kind of low grade stuff is going on in these sort of sexual exploitation rings that the gang is running. Um, but yeah, you do hear these kind of very outlandish stories about them taking over entire, apartment blocks or migrant centers in New York City. Um, I
Have you
don't
been able to
think,
separate the wheat from the chaff on that? How much truth? And again, this will be tough for you, even as a journalist, if you're only looking at other journalists' material and their product. It's a weird time right now because people are weaponizing information for sure. And I say that
yeah,
equally across the board. The left says only the right's doing it. The right says only the left is doing it. Maybe we could be reasonable people and say that everybody seems to be doing it.
hmm
But in an
yeah.
environment where that is the currency, how in the hell do you determine a fake bill from a real bill? It's tough.
It's very tough. I would say that like one outlet that I've been really annoyed by is the New York Post. They've done some really kind of stuff that cannot be true. I mean, like I was just saying, I was reading articles from one day to the next that completely contradicted each other by different freelancers or stringers or whoever. It's like this, so one cannot be true. So why are you publishing both of these stories? Like they're either not present or they've taken over the city. Like neither of these is the truth. There is a fantastic outlet that I always come back to called Insight Crime. They do reports, they do like backstories on these groups in Latin America. They've probably had the best kind of summations of where the Araguans are right now,
Mm-hmm.
which is that they work in very small pockets in major cities across North America. And their biggest kind of money earner is migration still. I mean, the numbers the numbers coming out of Venezuela are insane. I mean, they've lost like over 6 million people. Some estimates,
They've
I think,
lost over
they,
6 million people.
yeah, yeah, and some experts think they're going to lose up to 40% of their population after this latest sham election they had. That surprise, surprise, the leftist revolution won again.
Yeah.
Um,
So are people
so
just fleeing, or are we talking that the TDA is actually removing people from this country?
both. So
Okay.
people are fleeing. The gang is helping them do so for huge markups. Obviously, you know, they're it's where smuggling and trafficking kind of overlaps. There's some, you know, there's some uncertainty as to how willing these people are to pay huge amounts of money to get out of the country. Um, and yeah, it's not getting any better, and that means that this group is probably going to grow in size and embed itself more in American cities. Um, but they don't really get involved in the narcotics trade, which is what the vast majority of street gangs seem to be making their money from. So it is hard to pass the information. It really is because you do get conflicting stories from one day to the next. But they're definitely in the States for sure, and they're operating on a bigger level.
Ladies and gentlemen, today's episode is brought to you by Firecracker Farms. A question for you, perhaps it's too personal. Do you like things hot? I'm talking about your food. I'm actually talking about seasoning, in this case, specifically salt. Specifically, Firecracker Farm hot salt. I never thought salt could be, I guess the word would be dynamic. So Firecracker Farms, they're made with Ghost, Scorpion, and Carolina Reaper peppers. The flavor is ridiculously delicious, and everything you put it on gets better. It isn't too hot. If you're familiar with peppers, those three that I listed, they're spicy. But this is a choose your own adventure. The first time that I tried this salt, I put it on a ribeye steak, my personal favorite. I didn't really know what to expect because I've salted steaks many times before. But holy cow, this is the only thing I have put on any steak that I have made since that day. Firecracker Farm is a very small family brand. It's just the founder, Alex, and his family going all in on a great product and supporting great causes, like Operation 300 and the Pipe Hitter Foundation, with a percentage of every sale. Alex has been legitimately bugging me to be a sponsor of Change Agents for a while now. And here's what I can wholeheartedly say. His product is, in fact, awesome. It's not as good as you might think it is, it's better. So go get some while you can at firecracker.farm. Use code Ironclad to get 15% off your first order at firecracker.farm. What would you mentioned both of the places where I actually have some show notes in front of me. One was the apartment buildings in Colorado.
Mm.
To the best of your knowledge, what is actually going on there? Because again, depending on what outlet you listen to, one, they have completely fortified this apartment complex, and they are essentially, my words, not necessarily anybody else's, extorting the people that live there.
Mm-hmm.
And then other people are saying, no, that story isn't true. We may have some people that are loosely associated with this organization, but it's nowhere near what it is being portrayed as.
I think it's more on the side of the latter. I don't think that gangs are doing that in the States. I think the gangs are doing that elsewhere outside the country.
Mm-hmm.
They are extorting people for sure. They're doing that. But the idea they could take over an entire apartment block in an American city, I think that's quite far-fetched. I don't think they have that power. They're violent, sure, but there are other gangs that are far more violent present in America, and they're not on that scale. They're
Yeah.
scary, but they're not on that scale. And the worrying signs are the kind of net migration from Venezuela. And something I didn't mention before is that because Venezuela and the US are nominally enemies, they don't share data in who's coming over or who's been lost. And because, Venezuela is in this perpetual state of revolution, they don't take people back. There's no extradition. There's nothing like that. So it's just a dark zone. Who's coming over? Who's getting out of Venezuela? The Venezuelans don't want to share that information. The Americans can't get it. So that's where a big problem arises, is just a lack of information. And I think that's playing out in the media to some extent.
So somebody from Venezuela who is, for whatever reason, starts interfacing with the federal system and they determine that they need to be exported or returned home, they can't go back to Venezuela. How does the United States deal with that?
Well, quite. It's not so easy to deal with, and you see like a massive backlog of in centers across the country because it is really hard. It's like they're effectively refugees. I mean, they've come from a
Hmm.
country that the US has designated as essentially as on the same similar level as a war zone. I mean, it sanctions the country to the nth degree. So if it makes that statement about Venezuela, then what can it do to to send people back? Because they are technically then fleeing, you know, a hardship that you can't just send them back. So that makes it legally difficult on the US side. And the Venezuelans don't want them, right? Because they're not contributing to the revolution. They're like the East Germans that fled across the Berlin Wall. Once they left, they're no longer communists or whatever. So it's just like it's a real, it's a shitstorm. It really is. It really
Yeah.
works to no one's benefit on either side.
So, do you have any idea what the U.S. currently does or what the policy is? If they're not willing to send them back to Venezuela, what do they do with these individuals? Do they send them to a different country?
Well, I don't know a lot about that, but I think at the moment it's just a backlog. There just really is just
They
a
don't really do
bottleneck
much of anything.
of
Yeah.
bureaucracy. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. There's not a lot going on, and because there's an election coming up, no one really wants to prod that hornet's nest. You know, one side doesn't want to admit there's a problem. The other side would like to keep the problem as loud as it can. So
Yeah.
no one really wants to figure out what's going on here, and I don't think we're going to find out a huge amount in the next sort of month or so as things, like you say, hopefully transition to a new period in peace.
Like I said, hopeful but not optimistic.
Yeah.
Um, so you mentioned New York City here a little bit. One of my notes is showing that there was a report that the TDA, there was a crew of them targeting New York City migrant shelters and around Times Square. Any truth to that, or is that a little bit sensationalized as well? What have you been able to find about that?
No, I think that's going on for sure. Yeah, I think that I think that the truest stories and the most believable stories are the ones where people with less agency are being manipulated. People in migrant centers, obviously, they have no ties, they have very little agency, and it's incredibly believable that they would be targeted by this group, especially as they have the commonality of Venezuela, um, and the authorities there are pretty thin on the ground. So I could imagine that these people are being sort of forced into doing various things or being extorted or yeah, I do think that a lot of those stories carry weight. And you hear about people. There was the guy, I think he's on trial now, or maybe he's being sentenced for the attempted murder of a couple of cops in New York City. The guy
I'm,
was doing DoorDash delivery with a gun in his sack.
yeah, and then I'm trying to think. There was an attack in Times Square as well on police officers, but I believe those people fled New York. I don't know if that was tied
Mhm.
or those are two different stories, but because I believe they caught the person from New York in California and they're still determining what to do with that individual.
Well, that's the thing, right? I think this gets to the heart of this, what this problem actually is, because are these members of a gang? Are they best buddies? No. Is this gang more likely a kind of franchise that bonds various criminals that have come out of Venezuela? Probably similar to MS-13 and
Hmm.
Barrio 18. These other street gangs from Latin America. Um, so it's more like a franchise operation, I would imagine, where they're operating siloed. I mean, I can't see how Araguan gangsters in Colorado are in any way linked to someone in New York City, other than by the name of the gang that will carry some weight in their community.
Yeah. And also, I can't even imagine thinking back to Venezuela. I'm assuming right now that TDA's power and influence is probably still growing in Venezuela.
Yeah,
I doubt
yeah.
that they would care what the far end tentacles, what an individual that may claim association or not, or a small group may claim association or not in Colorado or New York. I don't know how much people at the top of the organization in Venezuela would actually even care.
Well, it's the other way. In fact, they use them. So we've seen examples all over the world. I mean, China does this with organized criminals a lot in countries that it wants to influence. Um, there was a case, I believe it must have been last year, where a Venezuelan dissident in Santiago, Chile, the capital there, was murdered by an alleged member of the Araguan gang, and his body stuck under the floorboards of a public toilet or something. It was a pretty horrible case. So there's increasing evidence that, either because it's like a runaway train with these gangs and the government just feels like they want to use them, or because they're beefing them up themselves. The Venezuelan government is now using the gangs and its various tentacles to sort of exert its power beyond its borders. That I can well believe that's almost certainly going on. People are leaving this country because its economy is just dreadful. I mean, the country just functions as a money laundering exercise for a few elites within the government hierarchy. So it would make every sense that they use organized criminals to carry out, extrajudicial killings on foreign soil, and try and squeeze some money back into the economy through migration. I don't doubt that at all.
How old is Nino now? Where is he at these days?
He is out and about. I think he's in Caracas. I might be wrong about that. But he'll be what, in his he'll be 40 years old, early 40s. So he would have been sort of the ripe old man of Venezuelan
Yeah.
gangs at this point.
So he's been cracking at this for a while.
Yeah, thanks to the prison system. Um, Also, that's something that's not just unique to Venezuela. That's going on all over the world, that gangs get huge in prison. The
Yeah.
stuff in El Salvador, exactly the same thing until Bukele came along. So, yeah, I don't see this becoming less of a story. It's just what the story is and what the narrative is kind of fluctuating at the moment. I think that will settle once the election happens.
Yeah. What I'm looking at my show notes again. The number 23 and the significance of Michael Jordan. How does this tie in? I'm assuming Michael Jordan is not aware of this tie-in, so they're probably appropriating his number.
Yeah, he should sue them maybe. I don't know. It's really bizarre. In fact, it was funny because I just saw the 23 for a while. I didn't know the Michael Jordan reference. So I was like, oh, this must be a David Beckham reference because his name was 23. But David Beckham took the 23 off of Michael Jordan, I think. But I don't know. I didn't know. Maybe Venezuela, is it big in basketball? Are they big on that?
In Venezuela, I could actually see them being strong on both. I could see them being fans of basketball. They would probably call it football. Soccer for us
They would
English
be
folk.
correct.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose. But yeah, and so do they wear jerseys? How does the number 23 represent itself? Is this a tattoo that they get? What's the tie-in?
It's a tattoo, right? So that, again, this is one of the stories that the Post has put out recently that I feel like I'm not buying it. So the tattoo one is the exact example I was giving you earlier, that where they're like, one day they're really scary because they don't have gang tats, so we can't even know who they are. The next day they've got this expose on how they use like the number 23 with a clock. I think they have some of them have a tattoo of a grandfather clock or something, a really old clock with the number 23. I'm like, really? Because
that's a combination of things that don't mesh incredibly well.
yeah, it just looks like, I've seen pictures of it. It looks like some kind of steampunk thing. It doesn't look like a kind of gang tat. So I don't know. I don't know about that. Maybe I'm missing something, but yeah, I'm not sure.
What's going on, everyone? This episode is also brought to you by Allegiance Gold. Gold prices have surged, reaching nearly $2,500, a 20% increase in under a year. With traditional investments under scrutiny, gold and other precious metals have become attractive alternatives. The rise in gold prices reflects growing skepticism towards conventional investments and highlights its stability. Notably, even banks are increasing their gold reserves, underlying its lasting value. Gold isn't just a short-term play, it's a long-term strategy for financial security and growth. Whether you're an experienced investor or just starting, gold should be a part of your investment portfolio. Start securing your financial future with Allegiance Gold, a trusted leader in precious metals with top ratings from TrustLink and an A+ accreditation from the Better Business Bureau. Allegiance Gold can help you protect your IRA or 401k with physical gold and silver, or delivers precious metals securely to your doorstep. If that sounds interesting to you and you go to protectwithandy.com today, listeners will get an exclusive lowest price on the market for select gold bars. That is protectwithandy.com, or you can call 844-790-9191 to talk to an account representative.
The exportation of human beings, the trafficking in human beings. It's a topic that I've done quite a few episodes on, human trafficking. First few times I sat down with somebody, it was, speaking only for myself, honestly, it was unsettling because I didn't realize the visible yet invisible nature of it, and how, you think human trafficking, at least for me, when I first started digging into it, I assumed that it was largely sexual in nature, sex workers, sex trafficking. And, I grew up in an area in California where agriculture was a main staple, artichokes, strawberries, all these things. And talking to these people about the brokers that would exist in between the workers and the people who own the farm, who are actually taking the money and housing these people in apartments or houses with 20 and 30 people and giving them limited money, and how that is trafficking in itself, or hotel staff. Or it was insane to see the size, scope, and scale of that issue. It goes so much. And come to find out now, my understanding is, the sexual human trafficking is certainly a portion of that, but it's a smaller fraction of the whole. And, our border in the U.S. is obviously contentious. There, again, given the environment that we are in, and I don't know how we landed on this binary opposites of it's completely open or it's completely closed. There's a huge problem or there is no problem. Even though my own personal experience, I've found almost nothing in life that is that binary. But that is the argument that is being, or not the argument, the position that is being put forward. But the border, right? Half that border is on the U.S. and the other half of that is on the Mexican side. And I've done quite a few episodes on the power and influence of the cartels as well. And I'm curious, in your research, have you come into any knowledge or information where the TDA, I mean, obviously if they're moving people, it's not like it's happening invisibly through these countries that they're operating in. Have you found anything that has indicated that they are working, by, with, and through the cartels at all for this human trafficking operation?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. The big cartels, the two big ones in Mexico, for example, the CJNG and the Sinaloans. Yeah.
Yep.
The migration is a huge part of their profit now. I think what struck me recently when I've been sort of researching stories that have nothing to do with migration and also involve the US border. I'll give you a great example. I went to India last May, I think it was, to report a story about a fake cricket league set up to scam bettors in Europe. That story involved, and while I was out in the part of West India called Gujarat, huge state, 70 million people, that state has a huge issue with people paying smugglers to get into the Texas border. And so
Really?
you're finding US border patrols are finding people from Gujarat, families of 5 or 6 people, trying to in Mexico, and they're working with cartels to get these people from India and China and like Sudan and places you wouldn't imagine that they're coming across this border. It's so internationalized now; it's off the scale. And I
How
guess
are they
that gets to
facilitating all that? I mean, India, and for those of you not familiar with geography, India and Mexico are separated by a few things, a little bit of land, a little bit of water. Not the easiest logistical problem to solve, let alone how do you get in? I mean, I don't think you go on to www.smugglemeacrosstheborder.com. I might need to look into getting that website actually,
Yeah.
just so I can deny it to other people. You know, I mean, obviously, I mean, tongue in cheek, but it's not as if it is consumer facing, directly. How are they facilitating this and coordinating this? Families in India, how are they getting a hold of these people, these brokers, and the whole process? I mean, how does that happen?
Well, it kind of gets to what you were saying a minute ago, that it's in everybody's interest to keep the gears working slickly. So brokers in Indian states are not hard to find. It almost is like logging onto that website. It's so out there. And in a country where, you're going to pay your cops, what, $30 a month?
Yeah.
Who cares? They're not going to stop anything. I mean, why does some cop in rural India care if a family of five wants to travel to the US illegally? He doesn't. Um, what's more, the state governor, why does he care? He doesn't. He's probably getting paid. And we've seen this now, that the illegal gangs or groups or whatever you want to call them, especially the cartels in Latin America, they're so embedded in politics, but also the legal economy now. They are so present there. They are unstoppable. Um, you saw it with the indictment of this, what was he? He was like the anti-drug czar, the Mexican guy who just got sentenced, I think, in New York a couple of weeks ago, maybe a week ago. This guy was the former president's man. He was the guy. And he was a cartel guy. Presidential aides of the former president AMLO, they've been involved in the drug trade. He
Yeah.
himself has been implicated in the drug trade. This stuff is so entrenched now that it's winding itself around governments like a boa. It's squeezing them. There are entire narco states in the world now that fulfill every definition of the word. I mean, West African states really struggling with this. Also, huge places for migration. So, uh, whatever side of the political divide you are on, it's just the size of this illicit industry. It's probably trillions of dollars. It's like colossal. Um, how do you stop it? Beyond my pay grade, but
Yeah. I
it's
was going to
just
ask you if you
yeah.
have, I mean, when it, when the size, scope, and scale of the organization gets to a place where you feel like it's touching everything from illicit to legal, and using your description, they're unstoppable. Where does that leave you?
I think you have to be more realistic about the scale of the issue before you can start to solve it, right? So I'm British. A big part of the narrative at the moment is the boats coming over from France, people in dinghies. Um, it's overplayed by one side of the divide. It's
Mhm.
underplayed by the other. Until you realize the scale of it, you're never going to solve it. And you have to understand that with currents of climate change and economic change and things like this, people are going to travel. That you're not going to stop it. Um, I think that one big thing that people make a mistake about is that you need to stop it at your border. The most successful operations tend to be ones that are multilateral, that work to prevent people being smuggled at the country of exit.
Mhm.
I think that has begun to work a little bit in Europe, in parts of Southern Europe, with people in, say, I don't know, Greece, for example. Um, so it's not just an American problem, the border. It's a El Salvadorian problem. It's a Venezuelan problem. Until you work with other countries and you kind of admit or you acknowledge the size of the problem, I don't think you can make a dent. I don't think you could even ding it, to be honest. It's just too huge.
Yeah. What would the just a pure curiosity, the mechanics of a family of five in India, what would that travel look like? How would they actually end up at the US border?
I think they would pay a broker to get some kind of entry into a Latin American state. Although I think there's some kind of reciprocity with Canada as well, because there was a case where a really tragic case where a family had frozen to death on the US Canada border, and they were from like a really random part of India.
Mhm.
Um, so they would be flying in and traveling across several borders until they get to Mexico, um, which means they're getting um, extorted along every step of the way. And they're kind of at the mercy of people who are pretty bad guys. So it's just, it's great that we live in this globalized economy and we're able to travel all over the world, but it just means that this is going to take place as well, sort of no less easily. And
Mhm.
if a family of five from Gujarat can travel to, I don't know, to Colombia and make their way through, I mean, the Darien Gap, you've seen some stuff on the New York Times where they've been doing some really good reporting on that. What are you going to do to stop Indian people going through the Amazon? I mean, I don't think you can.
Yeah,
So
I
yeah,
mean, good luck with that.
yeah, yeah, and because the world is becoming sort of slightly less multilateral at the moment, people are not sort of using the Security Council or the UN to just bash your opponents rather than try and work together. I can't really see how you solve an international issue nationally. I don't
Mhm.
think it works.
Yeah. In one of your recent episodes, and we've talked about this a little bit already. You talked about the potential human trafficking ring here in the U.S. run by the gang. How many states would you guess that is in? How complex would you say it is, and how large is the operation?
I've seen now, I could be getting this wrong, but I think I've seen about 6 or 7 different states implicated. I think it was like Virginia, New Jersey, New York. I think it was Florida, Colorado, and I'm gonna say California as well. I think it's there. So
Mhm.
it's it's in pockets, and I think at the moment it's in pretty small pockets. But given that so many people are flooding across the border from Venezuela or leaving the country at the very least, and we don't know who is a criminal and who isn't, I think the Biden administration says that like between zero point 0.5 and 0.9% of people are likely to be have serious criminal records. That's enough, and that will probably grow the issue. Um, yeah, like I said, I don't think we'll understand the full scale of this and what the operation really looks like. But I don't believe that they're a gang in the style of a narco cartel. I don't think it's as organized as that at all. I think it's merely a franchise that pulls together young men who are struggling to make a buck. So
Yeah.
and it's like street crimes as well. It's theft, it's robbery, it's extortion, it's sex trafficking. It's not moving tons of shipments across borders. It's not paying off, guards and border official. It's not this kind of stuff. It's pretty low level.
For the TDA cells, I'll call it that, in these states, and then people being, you know, the Indian family again, trying to make its way from India into the United States. Is there any connection with those cells, or are these people kind of left to navigate on their own when they get to the border, as a lot of smuggling operations, promise people they're going to get them across, and then they kind of point them in the right direction and say, best of luck? Or is the terminus of this organization is getting people to these cells, and then they are released into the wild, to use a poor metaphor, but also an accurate
Yeah.
one?
I think it is pretty. I think you are kind of left on your own to the
Okay.
mercy of the people at each border, as far as I understand it. So I think the Indian guy is going to get you as far as 4 countries away. Then you might be paying a bunch of other guys to get across. I mean, really dangerous borders there as well. I mean, you know, I would not want to be doing a huge amount of work on the Colombian Venezuelan border. There's a
No.
lot of stuff going on there. Um, and not just migration, obviously. These are places where a huge amount of very popular drugs are passing, very violent and dangerous people. So yeah, I think they're left to the mercy of these folks, and that's really tragic. Obviously, it's a really terrible life to be venturing out on potentially, but for millions of people around the world, America is the land of milk and honey, so they will do anything to get there. And
Yeah.
I don't think you can, it's not going to stop being that. So you've got to find a workaround because, yeah, I think this gang will become a bigger issue in the next year or two.
Well, I also think it's important to paint an accurate picture of what they are currently doing and capable of. Right? There's obviously what they could become, but as we've talked about, whether you're on the left or the right, there's no problem where it's the boogeyman that you have to tackle.
Hmm.
And that's why I asked a little bit about the mechanics of, how complicated are they? Because in the world that we live in, San Bernardino is a good example. The man and woman who ended up going on a shooting spree, both of them were killed, but they had never actually, in that particular instance, it was radical Islam, but they had never left the United States and truly associated or interacted with those groups, but they were influenced by that, and that's what the narrative was. They were acting out loosely attached to that ideology. But it wasn't as if, not that there aren't people from ISIS inside of the United States that are doing those type of things. It's an example of somebody can take an action under that banner and make it seem like it's a larger problem that it is. And I'm not trying to say that it's not a
Mm,
problem, but depending on how you discuss and view that, you could talk about this from, oh, there's 7 cells in these 7 states. And when somebody leaves India, they're being walked hand by hand by one of these TDA people who have this ultra complex organization that is manifested from the top by a guy waxing and twisting his mustache. And it's not the case, which I'm glad to hear. I
mm,
don't want
yeah.
that level of sophistication in the United States. Not that I want somebody abandoned at the border, but I also don't want this incredibly complicated, sophisticated criminal organization doing point to point human trafficking and just releasing people inside of cities. Hopefully, the United States can help find a solution to that before that. But I think it's important to talk about these things from a realistic and objective perspective as opposed to no
Yeah.
problem and boogeyman and being binary options.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of the pinnacle of that problem because Venezuela is the country for whatever reason that everyone loves to bash, so it's always going to be a boogeyman. By the way, you do have that, incredibly organized gang in the US already. It's called the Sinaloa Cartel. I mean, it
Oh,
basically
yeah.
runs entire countries. So these are your problems. They are manifold, but
Well, and
this gang, yeah.
that's why I asked about any interactions between the TDA and the cartels because, as a I mean, if you let's look at this from a business perspective and ignore for a second the horrendous treatment of human beings and the suffering and the damage that comes from that. If you wanted to grow and scale your business and you are tangential and parallel to another business model, more than likely you're probably going to interface with them if they have the infrastructure in place to communicate. I mean, fuck, this isn't rocket surgery.
Hmm. It's the thing about that is that I think the larger gangs have their own guys right now who are going to distribute. Um, Again, this is an imprecise world. It's not like you have a board meeting and you decide to do a merger with this group or that group. You've got your guys, and it trickles down to the street level guys, and they do their job, and they might be part of the Tren de Aragua, or they might be part of MS-13. They could just be lone wolves. And I think that they do seem to have got their asses kicked where they've tried to run into that narco world, especially in Latin America. And it doesn't seem like they're working with anyone right now. They're just not as entrenched.
Yeah.
They're new. But
As the
yeah, in the future it
landscape
could
shifts
be.
in front of them, just like anything else, they may evolve and read the terrain like anybody else does. I think it's a
Yeah.
very, and that's where the solution to everything from the war on drugs, which maybe we should probably find a new word for that because I think we lost that one,
Hmm.
or
Yep.
immigration or border policy. It's not a static target. It's a moving target, and I think the solution slash S solutions are going to have to be molded in real time as well.
Yeah, and they will have to be international. And I hope it's hard to see because let's say Mexico and the US, for example, there does seem like there's slightly more of a conversation happening now between the two countries on that front because it benefits both nations, governments to work together against these criminal organizations. I guess the question is how deeply are they embedded in one government and how out of control are they for the other?
Yeah.
Um, so that is one thing. I think Claudia Sheinbaum, the new Mexican president, she seems like she's got her head screwed on a little better when it comes to this stuff. But again, she's kind of her forebear's protege. So, and he was not good at all. It's the hugs not bullets philosophy that was well dumb, really,
Yeah.
and didn't do anything to stop the cartels.
What do you think the future is for the TDA in terms of its power, influence, reach? Do you think it rises to a level that might be similar to something of those cartels that we see in Mexico?
No, no, I don't think so. I think they're a street gang far more in common with the Salvadorans than with the Mexicans. but they probably will grow. Like I said, I mean, if 40% of Venezuela is leaving Venezuela, some of those guys are going to be part of this gang. They would have come out of those systems in the prisons at the very least, or the peace zones. I mean, what a ridiculous idea. Uh, so yeah, I mean, everything's conspiring to make them bigger, but they're not like a cartel. No, they will be street level thugs essentially.
What is being done in Venezuela to deal with this, if anything? Or is that just the reality of life in Venezuela?
It's getting worse. The economy's tanking again. Sanctions are not lifting. There's more sanctions being doled out by the West. Um, all the big economies are illicit at the very least in Venezuela. I mean, it can only trade its oil with, say, Russia and China. It trades a lot of gold on the black market, I think, Venezuela at the moment, and migration. So it's not getting better there. And it doesn't seem like the gangs are getting any smaller. So I wouldn't expect it to suddenly, miraculously die up. All of this stuff.
Final thoughts on, maybe I'll target this to a U.S. audience, because I think this episode will come out probably shortly before the election or right near it, where information is still going to be used, as it always is, to, buttress a point or tear down a point. Advice for people. I mean, you live in this world. You're a journalist. You're part of your job is separating the wheat from the chaff. And a lot of people don't have the time, or quite frankly, I would say interest to do so, but yet they are influenced by the information. So any advice on people on how to parse truthfulness from bullshit when it comes to reporting on groups like this?
Quick answer and a slightly longer answer. The quick answer is delete social media.
Well, that's not going to happen, sir.
That's not going to happen. No. So one that might be slightly more realistic is, I mean, just make yourself read 2 articles about the same subject. That's it. Just read 2 articles, 2 different outlets. But the mainstream media has its issues. There's no denying that. But it's also far better information than 99% of the posts that you would see on social media. So I think a more realistic thing might be, if you see something on social media, dig into it. Don't take it on face value, because increasingly these platforms, I mean, their only goal is to keep you on, right? So whether that's sowing division or peddling bullshit, it doesn't matter to them. They don't care. They can sing about, verifying facts and community notes and all this kind of stuff. It doesn't matter. So just, if you see something online, just back it up with 1 or 2 things. That's it. You might get closer to the truth. You might not, but it'll be better than some sort of weird conspiracy stuff that you might see elsewhere.
Yeah. And I would actually add a clarification to that, because you said if you see it on social media, dig in. I would say dig in on a non-social media platform, just to make sure that,
yes.
Because if you dig in on the social media platform, and again, they're beautiful for being connected and they're horrible for people being able to lose themselves and thinking the world that they see is the world that they live in. You go from one platform to the other, so you're not getting stuck in a little bit of a vortex.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there is something, I'm sure I'm not coining the phrase, but it's kind of credulous incredulity, right? It's, I don't believe anything, but that doesn't make you a critical thinker. That actually makes you an uncritical thinker.
Yeah.
So if you don't believe in anything, you'll believe anything. And that's where you see a lot of sort of conspiracy theories coming out of the woodwork, increasingly these days. And a lot of it comes from social media. So yeah, if you do see something online, go to a newspaper, go to a TV station. Better a newspaper, to be honest. So yeah. That might be pissing in the wind slightly, but it might help.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Thank you again for listening to Change Agents, an Ironclad original, presented by Firecracker Farm. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode and an all-new guest. See you then.